Welcome to the State of the Line podcast. I'm your host, Christine Pike, and today we are diving right into a topic that's top of mind for our industry stakeholders, and that's adverse weather and its impact on workers' compensation. Joining me today is NCCI's senior economist, Patrick Coate. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Christine. Happy to be here.
There is so much to talk about, so let's dive right in. First, let's define what adverse weather is when we're talking about it in workers' compensation. What are we referring to?
We're not just referring to extreme weather events like hurricanes or blizzards. What we're looking at is how frequency changed on hot, cold, or wet days compared to milder days in a similar place and similar time of year. So heat waves and rain and cold, icy days can all pose risks, and each of those conditions brings its own set of challenges.
But I want to give a shameless plug that NCCI's report is the only workers' compensation report that talks about cold weather as well. There's a lot of talk about heat, of course, but I think it's great that we also brought that in as well. And so we will link that in the show notes for our audience. And so that aspect, the cold piece, seems especially timely right now because much of the country is having a colder and snowier winter than average.
Absolutely. It was even below freezing overnight here, which is much colder than average. Exactly one of the reasons that we conducted the research the way we did was to try to be as insightful as we could to stakeholders in workers' compensation about all types of adverse weather. So in recent years, we've experienced an above average amount of adverse weather. We've had warm summers in 23 and 2024. The 2 years before that were costly winter storm seasons for insurance.
Indeed, and it's something definitely that folks are thinking about. Let's jump into the results of your research. What did you and your team find?
Right, so adjusting for all other factors that we could, we found that both hot and cold daily temperatures were associated with more workers' compensation claims than days with mild temperatures. For heat, we found that injury frequency increased modestly but consistently with daily high temperatures all the way from about 50 degrees to 100 degrees or more Fahrenheit, with about a 1% increase in injuries for every 5 degrees of temperature. So temperatures around 100, the impact on claims is around 10% versus those cooler days. And that baseline number is an average across all jobs and all types of claims, not just those types that we might expect to be most sensitive to weather conditions.
Patrick, you said that frequency increased modestly but consistently for heat. So let's talk about cold weather and the impacts there.
Right. For cold weather, we had a slightly different story. So on cold days, we saw higher frequency when high temperatures were around freezing, about 5% more than our mild weather baseline of 60 to 65 degrees. But we found that on days that were just a little bit cool, like highs in the 50s, and also the very coldest days, high temperatures 20 degrees and below, frequency was actually a little bit lower than the mild weather baseline. And another important point related to both heat and cold is that the relationship between temperature and frequency was a lot different for certain types of injuries and certain types of jobs.
That would probably include outdoor professions, I would imagine?
Yes, certainly for heat. So I know the impact of heat on construction workers has been in the headlines for years now, and we do see that in the data. So we found construction claims nearly 20% higher than the expected baseline when temperatures are above 100 degrees, so about twice the effect that we saw overall. We also saw more impacted by hot days were other outdoor sectors, like natural resource extraction and upkeep and maintenance, the latter which we defined to include a lot of landscaping jobs. We see smaller but still meaningful impacts in other industries as well. So claims across the board are higher than that expected baseline in physically demanding jobs, even those that are not always outside, but may be in not perfectly climate-controlled conditions, like transportation and warehousing jobs, like some manufacturing jobs. Even for office and healthcare workers who are mostly inside in climate-controlled environments, we saw small increases above that expected claim frequency on the hottest days.
And what about for cold weather then?
On cold days, we found the largest effects for transportation and warehousing, especially on days with precipitation. In bad weather, especially in wet weather, we see big increases in the risk of motor vehicle accidents and slip and falls versus warmer or drier days. We also saw increased claim rates on cold days for office, healthcare, and that upkeep and maintenance sector.
Let's go back to construction workers that we were talking about before. How would they be impacted by cold?
That's a good question. For construction, for natural resources and manufacturing, we actually found lower injury frequency on cold days than the mild weather baseline. And one potential factor there is that outdoor work may be less likely to be performed on days that are particularly harsh. We don't see directly in our data what's happening on a work site each day.
So, Patrick, that makes sense. And you mentioned for cold weather that there's an increased risk of slip and falls. What do you find as it relates to cause of injury?
So on cold days, we also found frequency is lower for contact, strain, and other injury types than at the 60 to 65 degree baseline. Slip and falls, as well as motor vehicle accidents, were especially prevalent on cold and wet days. The impact on motor vehicle accidents was small on cold but dry days. Frequency increased for slip and falls in our data compared to baseline, even on cold and dry days, but not nearly as much on cold and wet days. For days warmer than our baseline, we found claims increase with heat on dry days for all injury types. At the baseline temperature, there were more slip and falls and motor vehicle accidents on wet days than on dry days, but for the other types, we found a few more claims on dry days.
And you mentioned precipitation and the impact that it can have. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so we found that precipitation matters most on cold days, so the overall impacts are concentrated in colder areas. So the winter precipitation will have a much bigger overall impact on claims in the coldest cities in our data, like Denver, for example, than on warmer cities, like Phoenix or like South Florida, where we're talking right now. And not only that, but if you have like an especially wet winter season, that matters more on the margin in those cold cities too, because basically extra snow or extra icy weather is going to be a lot worse than extra rain in a warmer city.
So the coldest cities are the most impacted by adverse weather conditions. And I understand that, but what about for heat? Is it the same relationship?
Well, yes and no. So we see hotter cities do have the biggest heat impacts because obviously they face more hot days than cooler cities. So compared to, imagine if a city experienced our baseline 60 to 65 degree weather every single day, we found construction claims in the summer were about 13% higher in the warmest cities. And for the coldest cities, that overall impact was about half of that. But because we found that claim impacts increased steadily with heat, having an extra hot summer compared to where you are resulted in about the same increase in injuries for hotter or more temperate cities, about 0.5% for every degree of average temperature. So another way to say that is that we found bigger impacts for like a 90 degree day versus an 80 degree day, but our estimates suggest the marginal impact on claims of going from 80 to 85 degrees is about the same as going from 90 to 95. So it's not only the very hottest days to keep an eye on.
So it is something that you would expect that in the colder temperatures, there could be icy conditions and such. But what we didn't expect, what we didn't necessarily know is the data behind it. And I mean, this is great research. And so I really appreciate that you took this time to talk about hot and cold temperatures. The adverse weather paper is on ncci.com. We'll link it in the show notes. One more thing, Patrick, I understand you are talking about a different topic at AIS about demographics. Is that true?
You heard right, Christine. We will be talking about demographics and kind of work our way from what's going on in population demographics to how that affects the workforce and work injuries. And I'll be talking about some of that, and some of my colleagues will be talking more about what we see in our own NCCI data.
You are a multi-talented individual, Patrick. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to get in touch with Patrick, you can reach out to him at insights@ncci.com. We welcome your questions and we respond to each one that we receive. Thank you for joining us on the State of the Line podcast. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is the copyrighted material of the National Council on Compensation Insurance, 2026. All rights reserved.